Several years ago, there was a famous shoe company that sent one of its salespeople to a faraway and distant land in the hope that they would be able to establish their business and make sales. After a few months, the employee sent a note back to head office saying, "I'm coming home. Nobody here wears shoes." A few months later, the company was still determined to try to break into this country and sent another employee thinking that certainly there must be a market for the sale of shoes. And a few months after the new employee was there, she sent a message back to head office. "Send more order forms. Nobody wears shoes here. I can sell more shoes." You see, the second person saw the opportunity before her, not the difficulty, and she ran with the opportunity, knowing that she would be able to make a profit and be able to do well for the company. She succeeded because she had a certain sense of faith. She had a faith in the product, she had a faith in the people, and she had a faith in her ability to be able to sell to others. And as a result of that faith, she was able to make a difference, and the company was able to flourish. Today, as we gather to celebrate our Eucharist, we are also reflecting upon the gift of faith and how even a small amount of faith keeps us on the right track and allows us to be God's disciples and to be able to do His will. In fact, all of our readings this morning speak about various aspects of the gift of faith and how it can be applied and lived in the midst of our daily lives. In our first reading this morning from the book of the prophet Habakkuk, the prophet is reminding the people of Israel how it is necessary for them to be able to keep their faith, even in the midst of the disaster and hardship that they are undergoing. The people of Israel have become discouraged. They wonder, perhaps, has God forgotten them? Has He not remembered His promise to them that He would take care of them? And why is it they're undergoing this difficulty and hardship? But the prophet reminds them that God, in fact, has not forgotten them, that God is true and faithful to His promise. "I will be your God, and you will be my people." And as a result of that, the prophet then encourages the people of Israel to persevere, to be patient, and to persist, even in the midst of the obstacles and difficulties that are before them. For God has not forgotten them, but God will work in His way and His time to be able to accomplish His will and to build His kingdom in the here and now. And it is for that reason that the prophet concludes his words today in our reading, reminding the people of Israel long ago, and still us today, that the righteous person lives by faith. That if they are able to live by faith, trusting in God's providence and God's goodness, then no matter what it is that they're undergoing, that God will be with them, and God's will be achieved. In a similar manner, in our gospel today, we hear two more of the parables from St. Luke, and we hear of the parable of the mustard seed and the parable on the unappreciated servant. And both of these parables at first seem to have no connection with one another. But when we take a step back and upon further reflection, we see how, in fact, they do tie into the gift of faith and how the disciples are called to live that faith moment by moment, day by day. We hear at the beginning of our gospel this first parable of the mustard seed, and Jesus begins to tell this parable because the apostles have cried out to Him, "Increase our faith." Why is it that the apostles are crying out for their faith to be increased? Well, just prior to this moment, Jesus had been teaching the apostles and the disciples the necessity for them to be people of forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus has told them that it is not enough to forgive their neighbor once, twice, 3 times, but they must forgive 70 times 7. In other words, there is no limit to forgiveness. And as the apostles begin to internalize this teaching, they realize how difficult and challenging it is. How can they be people of forgiveness like this? And therefore they know that they cannot do it alone. And they cry out to God, increase our faith. They believe that if they have only more faith, they will be able to be these men of reconciliation and forgiveness. But through the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus reminds the apostles long ago, and still us today, that it is not the quantity of faith that makes a difference in the lives of his followers, but it is the quality of faith. And so he speaks about that tiny little mustard seed, the tiniest of all seeds, but given time, given the proper ingredients, given the sun, it grows to become the sturdiest of all trees. Out of something that seems so insignificant, it becomes sturdy and immovable. And in a similar way, Jesus says the same about the gift of faith, that when one receives the gift of faith, which is a free and generous gift by God to each and every person, that faith has the ability to become strong, to become bold, to become active. One does not need a huge quantity of that faith, but it is the quality of that faith that will allow them to persevere, to persist. It will allow them to be like Habakkuk says, the righteous person will live by faith, and God will assist them in the midst of this. And so Jesus recognizes that each and every person only needs to have a little bit of faith, and that if they surrender and trust in God, God will do the rest for them. In a similar way, as Jesus continues to speak about faith, he presents to them this same strange second parable, the parable about the unappreciated servant. We hear that the servant has worked all day long in the master's field. He comes home thinking that he can have something to eat and get some time to relax before the next day that he has to start again. But instead, as soon as he comes in, the master makes further demands of him to prepare something for the master to eat, and then he can take his rest. And why is it that Jesus would speak about this unappreciated servant and raise him up as a model and guide for his apostles and disciples? Because it is a reminder that, like the servant who was doing what he ought to do, that discipleship is not a time-limited moment. It is not a 9-to-5 job, and then one can sit back and relax until the next day. But instead, authentic Christian discipleship involves 24/7. It involves a radical availability and surrender to be willing to do whatever God asks, whenever God asks. And therefore, like the servant, his disciples need to be ready and prepared to be able to put their faith into action whenever the situation requires it, whenever God invites them to do so. And so Jesus reminds the disciples long ago, and us still today, that our faith needs to be lived out in real ways, in real time, regardless of the cost. And when we are able to do so, then in fact our faith begins to grow even more and more, because we become more aligned to God's will in our lives and are able then to build the kingdom in the here and now. And so both the prophet Habakkuk and Jesus remind the followers in their day and age and our day and age of how it is that we need to surrender and trust in God, that with God all things are possible. And this is why in our second reading today, as St. Paul is writing to his friend Timothy and the early Christians, in the midst of their discouragements and struggles, St. Paul reminds them of how it is that they need to live their faith. St. Paul doesn't ask them to be able to search to find new faith, to be able to somehow increase their faith like the apostles. But what advice does St. Paul give to Timothy? He simply says to him to rekindle the gift of God that is within. St. Paul came to be able to recognize that the gift of faith was already planted in the hearts of each and every person, and they simply needed to be able to rekindle that gift when they became weary, like the people of Israel long ago, or the apostles that day after Jesus' teaching on forgiveness. And the same is true for us, that in the midst of our life journey, we can oftentimes be like the people of Israel. When we look at what is happening in our world, the violence, the darkness, the chaos that is there, when we bring it down to what's happening within our circle of friends and in our home and in our personal lives, at times we can be overwhelmed by what is happening, and we can begin to wonder, has God abandoned us? Has God forgotten about us? And like the people of Israel, we need to be reminded that we need to be patient. We need to be persistent. We need to be persevering, that God is true and faithful to his promises. And therefore, we need to continue to be upright and righteous and to live by faith, trusting in God. Just like the apostles, there can be moments in our lives when we feel overwhelmed at the tasks that we have to do, what God is calling and inviting us to live. And so we too might want to simply have more faith so that we can get through this. But instead, we must remember that God has already equipped us with everything that we need if we simply trust and surrender to him moment by moment, day by day. And so we recognize that faith is not some type of magical wand that will exempt us from the difficulties, the trials of life or the world. But faith then is that humble trust in the power and the presence of God to be at work in our lives, the lives of our loved ones, and the life of our world. And when we are able then to grow in that humble trust of God, surrendering to him, then we know that we are on the right pathway. And so, like the two salespeople, we have a choice. We can be like the first and just simply throw the towel in the midst of defeat and difficulty. Or we can be like the second and see the opportunity that is given and to invest our time and our talent to be able to bring forth God's will and to build his kingdom. Let us pray that day by day we will grow in that humble trust in the power and the presence of God and always be mindful that he is near us.